The 6th of June, 1944. The coast of Normandy trembles as Allied forces storm the beaches of occupied France. Steel crashes against concrete, artillery roars, and the fate of Europe begins to turn. Within weeks, Nazi control starts to collapse from the west. In the east, another truth emerges. In July 1944, Soviet troops enter Majdanek, exposing the first major Nazi camp to the world. What they find cannot be explained by words alone. Behind the barbed wire stand survivors who look barely human, living witnesses to a system built on exhaustion, starvation, and terror. The illusion of German order shatters. And as the world begins to understand what the Third Reich truly was, one name surfaces repeatedly among the perpetrators: Otto Moll. To some, he was a disciplined SS man. To others, he became a symbol of how absolute power corrodes the human soul. This is the story of how an ordinary life descended into calculated cruelty. Otto Moll was born on the 4th of March, 1915, in the small town of Hohenschönberg, then part of the German Empire. His childhood unfolded during a period of national humiliation and uncertainty. Germany's defeat in the First World War had shattered old certainties, leaving behind economic hardship, wounded pride, and a generation raised amid resentment rather than stability. Moll grew up without distinction, neither remarkable nor visibly dangerous, a young man shaped more by circumstance than ambition. As a teenager, he trained as a professional gardener, a trade rooted in patience and routine. Those who knew him later recalled nothing exceptional in his early demeanor. He showed no clear ideological passion, no visible fanaticism. Yet there was a fragility beneath the surface. In January 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Moll was only 17, standing at the threshold of adulthood as the nation itself crossed into dictatorship. In 1936, Moll joined the SS, initially serving in a marching band rather than a combat unit. Then came a turning point that would quietly alter the course of his life. During a transport accident near Birkenau, Moll suffered severe injuries, including a fractured skull and the loss of an eye. He survived, but something fundamental had changed. Former comrades later believed that both his body and mind were damaged, leaving behind a man increasingly unstable, easily directed, and dangerously pliable. Otto Moll did not enter the Nazi system as a convinced ideologue. He drifted into it at a moment when Germany itself was drifting toward extremism. The rise of the Nazi Party was fueled by a narrative of betrayal and victimhood. Defeat in the First World War was not explained as a military failure, but as the result of enemies within. Jews, political dissidents, and minorities were framed as threats to national survival. For young men like Moll, this worldview offered clarity, belonging, and a sense of purpose that ordinary life could not provide. Inside the Schutzstaffel, ideology was reinforced through discipline rather than debate. Loyalty replaced morality. Orders replaced judgment. Moll's injury had left him dependent, both physically and psychologically, on authority. The SS did not demand reflection, only obedience. Over time, violence was no longer presented as cruelty, but as duty. Dehumanization became routine. Victims were reduced to categories, numbers, and labels that erased empathy. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was gradual, methodical, and encouraged. Moll learned that initiative in brutality was rewarded, not punished. Advancement came not from competence alone, but from willingness to act without hesitation. Within this system, moral boundaries dissolved. What remained was a man shaped by ideology, protected by uniform, and ready to carry out crimes not as excesses, but as normal procedure. Otto Moll's transformation from a marginal SS recruit into a central figure within the Nazi camp system unfolded step by step. each assignment drawing him deeper into a structure designed for systematic destruction. Between 1938 and 1941, he was stationed at Sachsenhausen, north of Berlin. Officially, he supervised a gardener's work detail. Unofficially, he learned how power functioned inside a camp. Prisoners quickly understood that survival depended not on rules, but on the temperament of the men who enforced them. Moll observed this lesson carefully. At Sachsenhausen, Moll came under the protection of Rudolf Höss, a rising figure in the SS camp administration. When Höss was appointed commandant of Auschwitz in May 1941, Moll followed him there. Auschwitz was no longer merely a detention center. It was evolving into something far larger, more industrial, and more final. Moll arrived with his family and lived among the camp infrastructure, blurring any remaining line between private life and mass crime. Initially, Moll oversaw agricultural labor units, but by June 1942, he was placed in charge of the penal company, housed near the notorious Block 11. Prisoners sent there were isolated from the rest of the camp and assigned the harshest tasks. The purpose was not correction, but attrition. Those who survived the assignment rarely emerged intact. Within this environment, Moll gained a reputation that spread quickly among inmates and SS personnel alike. He did not merely enforce discipline, he escalated it. As Auschwitz expanded into an extermination center under direct orders from Heinrich Himmler, Moll's role shifted again. Before the large crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau became operational, he was involved in directing mass killings at earlier facilities, including Crematorium I and improvised gas chambers known as Bunkers I and II. These sites were transitional mechanisms, evidence of a system still refining its methods. Moll was not a passive participant in this process. He adapted quickly, learning how to manage large groups, conceal outcomes, and maintain operational speed. By 1943, the newly constructed crematoria at Birkenau were in full operation. The process followed a strict routine. Transports arrived. Selections were conducted by SS physicians, among them Joseph Mengele. Decisions were made within seconds, based solely on appearance. Moll supervised the infrastructure that followed. Property was collected and sorted. Movements were timed. The machinery ran with bureaucratic precision. In September 1943, Moll was appointed commandant of the Fürstengrube and Gleiwitz, the first subcamps, both part of the Auschwitz system. His authority expanded, and with it, his autonomy. By May 1944, he returned to Birkenau as head of all crematoria, just as the deportation of Hungarian Jews began. The scale was unprecedented. Moll understood that existing facilities would be overwhelmed. In response, he ordered the construction of open-air fire pits alongside the crematoria, complete with drainage systems designed to accelerate disposal. To those arriving, Moll presented calm efficiency. Victims were told they were being processed for labor. They were instructed to follow procedures, to remain orderly, to trust the system. Within hours, most were gone. Over an 8-week period from mid-May to early July 1944, approximately 424,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The majority did not survive selection. Moll coordinated the disposal process and supervised the forced labor units, known as the Sonderkommando. Prisoners compelled to assist in handling the dead. Refusal was not an option. Even within the SS, Moll was considered extreme. He enforced orders without hesitation and took personal initiative when procedures slowed. Prisoners spoke of him not as a man, but as a function, an extension of the camp itself. By the time the transports ended, Auschwitz had reached the peak of its killing capacity. Moll had become one of the system's most efficient operators, rewarded and promoted for his role. By early 1945, the world Otto Moll had helped sustain was collapsing. Soviet forces advanced from the east. Allied armies pressed in from the west. and the illusion of Nazi permanence dissolved into retreat and chaos. As the Auschwitz camp system was evacuated in January, Moll oversaw forced marches moving tens of thousands of prisoners westward. Hunger, exhaustion, and winter exposure did what bullets no longer needed to. Those who fell behind were removed from the column, their fate decided within seconds. Moll eventually arrived at the Kaufering subcamps, part of the Dachau system. Conditions there were catastrophic. Prisoners were forced to construct their own shelters, half-buried structures that offered little protection from rain or snow. Disease spread unchecked, food was scarce, and care for the sick was deliberately withheld. Moll exercised authority through fear, continuing the patterns he had perfected earlier, even as defeat became inevitable. In late April 1945, as American forces approached, Moll again forced prisoners onto a westward march. This time, there was no pretense of order. Near Dachau, he was implicated in the killing of prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion. On the 29th of April 1945, units of the United States Army liberated Dachau. Moll did not escape. He was arrested shortly afterward, stripped of uniform and authority, and placed in custody to face the consequences of his actions. In November 1945, Otto Moll stood before an American military tribunal during the first Dachau trial, held inside the former camp itself. The courtroom was surrounded by the physical evidence of what the system had produced. Moll was charged for crimes committed during the evacuation from Kaufering, specifically for the fatal shootings of prisoners who collapsed during the final marches. On the 13th of December 1945, the tribunal found him guilty and sentenced him to death by hanging. Notably, Moll was never prosecuted for his central role at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The vast machinery he helped operate remained only partially examined in court, a reminder that post-war justice could never fully account for industrial-scale crime. In May 1946, Moll was confronted by his former superior, Rudolf Höss, during proceedings connected to the Nuremberg trials. Moll admitted to limited wrongdoing, while denying broader responsibility. The record contradicted him. On the 28th of May, 1946, at Landsberg prison, Otto Moll was executed. He was 31 years old. His death brought closure to no family and relief to no victim. What remained was a lesson etched into history. Systems that reward obedience without conscience will always find men willing to become their instruments. The story of Otto Moll is not only about one man, but about a system that transformed compliance into catastrophe. It reminds us that history is shaped not just by leaders, but by those who choose to carry out their orders. If you value carefully researched stories that confront the darkest chapters of the past, consider subscribing to War Revealed, and join us as we continue to examine how crime, power, and punishment intersect in human history.